Cracking the Code viewers, in 2018, we learned how to alternate pick arpeggios like a bluegrass master. And to do that, we needed to do something even more important and fundamental first, and that is solve wrist motion. And that's tricky because the wrist can rotate in 360 degrees. And unfortunately for us as guitar players, almost all of them can be used to create motions that you might think of as fundamental or basic guitar playing motions. And so what we're talking about here is not just replicating the performances of virtuosos like Steve Morse, David Greer, Andy Wood, or Molly Tuttle. Even though all of those incredible players were in some way instrumental to helping us solve this puzzle. Instead, what we're really talking about is getting a better handle on the kind of basic motions you make every time you pick up the guitar so that we can teach core technique simply and clearly. And it took, no joke, I would say about 3 years of getting on planes and meeting with these incredible players and also with researchers who study hand and arm function until we knew what was going on well enough to both do some of these motions ourselves, but also to boil down what was going on in a simple way that makes sense for guitar players. And what we came up with is a way that you can look down at your hand and know categorically exactly what kind of wrist motion, or perhaps even combination of wrist motions, you might be making at any given moment. So, without further ado, we present to you the clockface system of wrist motion. So, wrist motion, how does it work? How does the wrist work? It's kind of a strange question, right? It's such a fundamental body part for guitar playing in general. It's one of the most used joints in picking technique. And the cool thing about the wrist is that it is capable of 360-degree motion. You can immobilize, for the most part, your forearm and trace a complete circle in the air. And it is precisely the ability to do this that is key for the wrist-based cross-picking technique that we're going to talk about today. Now, even though you can move in all these directions, and there are, as you can feel, if you just do this, move your arm when you do this, you'll feel all the stuff happening underneath the skin here. There's a lot of action going on. In fact, if you get the light hitting you just right, you can even see some of this muscle action under the skin. So out of all of this activity, let's say researchers or academics that study body motion tend to divide this into two categories of movement. One that goes side to side and one that goes up and down. This is a way of understanding the musculature necessary to make these movements happening. It's sort of a classification for the different things that are happening at the wrist joint. And the side to side wrist movement is called deviation. And the up and down wrist movement, this way, is flexion and extension. Specifically, flexion is this one. I go like that, and extension is the lifting movement. Now notice that I am demonstrating these movements with my arm stuck straight out in front of me. This is a way that I like to think about wrist movements because it represents kind of a neutral position of the arm, and it gives us a way to understand something which is deceptively complicated in terms of the things you may be doing on a guitar where your positioning might be a little bit, there may be more variables involved. So if we take the guitar out of the equation and we think about all these wrist movements from the perspective of the arm directly out in front of you, the analogy that I like to use is the clock face analogy. So this is my clock face theory, my quick and dirty clock face theory of wrist movement. And actually I wouldn't say it's a theory, it's more like an analogy that helps you understand what movements are happening when. So imagine your arm is outstretched pointing at the face of a clock, and imagine the clock is facing you. So the numbers that I'm going to give you are going to be reversed from your perspective. And imagine that the point where the minute hand and the hour hand connect at the center of the clock face, imagine that's time 0, just to give it a number, like your axes, right, in math. So you've got 0 in the middle, and then due north of you, straight up, would be 12, straight down would be 6, to the right would be 3, to the left would be 9. And then you'd have 2 up here, or really like 2:30 would be up and to the right, and 7:30 would be down and to the left, and then 4:30 would be down and to the right, and 10:30 would be up and to the left. Right. So the cool thing about this is now we have a way of describing all the different movements that the wrist can make. Any way that I want to move, I can just describe it by numbers on the clock face. So remember the side-to-side movement that we talked about. This is the technical term for this, or the anatomical term for this, is wrist deviation. We can think of it as 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock. So that's this, 9 to 3, and back again. And 0, again, sort of a neutral point in the middle. The flexion-extension movement, remember flexion is down and extension is up in this orientation. So instead, we can just think of that as 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Right? So these are the sort of the core movements that we use to think about what the wrist is doing at any given moment. So if I go this way towards 9 o'clock, that is deviating towards the thumb side of the wrist. If I do this, you can see I'm moving this way. The technical term for that is radial deviation. That's the fancy term. I'm going to give you a few more technical terms, and I'm not going to bog you down with this stuff, but I do think it's important to develop a vocabulary, at least very basic vocabulary for this stuff, because we're going to use it all the time when we talk about how these movements actually work. So again, neutral position at time 0. Radial deviation is to the left, towards 9 o'clock. Get back to time 0, and now move towards 3 o'clock, towards the pinky side of the wrist. That's ulnar deviation, and that is U-L-N-A-R. And it is named after, both of these terms are taken from the forearm bones that are on either side of your arm in this orientation. So if, again, you're at time 0, and you go like this, and you feel your arm, you'll feel that there's a bone here on the left. That's the radius bone. And this bone over here on the other side of your arm, on the right side, the pinky side, that is the ulna. And so when we move towards the radius, that's radial deviation. When we move towards the ulna, that's ulnar deviation. Again, it's just 3 o'clock to 9 o'clock. Now, side-to-side wrist movement on a guitar, that would look kind of like this. It would be this side-to-side movement. But again, here's the cool takeaway concept here, is that no matter which way my arm is pointing, I'm still going 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock. I don't know if you saw any of the Marvel movies featuring Doctor Strange, but they have this way of visualizing the spells that when he casts a spell, they draw all these cool geometric shapes in the air, and the shapes follow his arm movement. So very often it ends up looking like a disc that he's wearing as a gauntlet, and he goes like this, and you hear the circle, you see the circle. No matter which way he moves the arm, the disc moves with the arm. So in our case, we can think of the clock face very much like the Doctor Strange disc. If I turn my arm, the clock turns with it. If I point it this way or that way or any other direction, the clock face moves with it. So these numerical references, the time references that we're establishing, are always, they're fixed. So radial deviation is always going to be 9 o'clock. Ulnar deviation is always going to be 3 o'clock. And that is true no matter whether my arm is pointing down, up, to the side, or straight at the camera. That's the beauty of the clock face way of thinking. So that's deviation is side to side, it's 9 to 3. Flexion and extension is 12 to 6. And we don't reference the movement based on the presence of or the direction of the movement with respect to these forearm bones anymore. Extension is the one that goes towards 12 o'clock, and flexion is the one that goes towards 6 o'clock. And you can think of that if you tell a kid to make a muscle, they do something like this, and you tend to flex the wrist as you do that. Maybe that will help you mnemonically to figure out or to remember which one is flexion. Flexion is when you flex your arm. Very often when people do that, they tend to also flex the wrist when a kid does, their Superman kind of Hulk thing. So now you can think of these 4 points as basically like compass points, if you will. In neutral time orientation, when I'm at 0, I can go 9, I can go 3, I can go 12, and I can go 6. Now, here's the cool thing. What if we go to the other times? What do we call those movements, right? Well, let's get back to neutral time again, all right? Let's pick another time on the clock face that is not one of the 4 points and see what happens to the wrist when we try to move towards that. Let's say I'm starting at 0. What if I go to 2 o'clock? Or let's say 2:30, right? That's exactly up and to the right. What can we say, or how would we describe this wrist movement? If I go to 2:30 and then back to 0 again, and 2:30 and back to 0, well, what position is the wrist in when it's at 2:30? Well, let's think about it in terms of the 2 movements that we know, the side-to-side 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock movement and the up and down 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock movement, right? If I'm at 2:30, am I towards 9 or 3? I'm towards 3, right? I'm in this side of the clock. I'm on this side of the clock. Now, am I closer to 12 or closer to 6? I'm also closer to 12, right? Because I'm in the upper half of the clock face. So we've got our equator of sorts that goes from 9 to 3. And we go to 2:30, we're in the upper half, the northern hemisphere. And, but we're also in this side of the clock towards the 3, right? So basically what we can say about this wrist position is it is deviated, but it is also extended. In other words, it's two wrist movements happening at the same time. Technically speaking, that's how this movement is seen in anatomical terms. If you start at 0 and go to 2:30 and back, you are actually doing two movements at once. It doesn't feel like it. You can't really sense that there are different axes that are being called into play. That's not really the thing. It's not a thing that you consider consciously when you do this. But in anatomical terms, whatever muscle is necessary to make the hand move towards 3 o'clock is firing. And whatever muscle is necessary to make the hand move towards 12 o'clock is also firing. And because they're both firing at the same time, you get roughly 45 degrees of trajectory going up to 2:30. So this movement is a blend. It is a very common blend for guitar playing, as we'll see. But nevertheless, 2:30 is a blend. Now, let's say we drew a diameter of the clock face that starts at 2:30 and goes all the way to its opposing point. What would that be? Well, that would be 2:30 to about 7:30. Right? Well, how would we describe this movement? Well, same exact way. Am I closer to 12 o'clock or closer to 6? Well, when I'm down here at 7:30, I'm definitely in the southern hemisphere. I'm closer to 6. So that's flexion. And indeed, look at the arm. Look at the hand. It's flexed. But now we can also ask, am I closer to 9 or closer to 3? Well, I'm definitely closer to 9. I'm in this side of the clock face, right down here. And indeed, if I were to hold my hand like this, you can see that the wrist is also bent this way. So down at 7:30, I am both flexed and I'm also radially deviated. I'm deviating towards the 9. Again, a blended movement. So if we just trace that diameter from 7:30 to 2:30, if we just do this, we're making a blended wrist movement. Does it feel like two movements happening at once? Not really. Not to me, it doesn't. It just feels like the wrist moving on an angle, right? So in similar fashion, we can have the opposite diagonal. We can go from like 10:30 down to 4:30. We can do this, right? Also a very common wrist movement. And we could describe this in exactly the same terms, right? We can be, I'm definitely, if I look at it from the side, I'm definitely extended here. I'm pointing up. And if I look at it from here, I'm definitely over to this side. That's radial deviation, this thumb side of this movement. So I've got extension and radial deviation. And then if I go down to 4:30, I'm definitely flexed. Check that out. Very obvious. But I'm also, if you look at it this way, I'm definitely on this side of the forearm. I'm definitely all the way over here, not here. So I'm the opposite. I'm now ulnarly deviated, if that's even a word. But I'm also flexed at the same time. So again, diagonal movement. Very comfortable movement to do, actually. In fact, we interviewed researchers from the Hospital for Special Surgery here in New York who studied, they published a paper specifically on blended wrist movements. And this was like the nerdiest possible interview you could do, right? Because like here we're trying to figure out how these wrist movements are useful for guitar players, and we actually go and meet scientists that published a paper. And what they did was they studied, or they took a sampling of common things that people do with their wrists. Everything from hammering with a hammer to pouring. And they measured using motion capture in a laboratory setting. They measured the amount of each one of these wrist movements that happens during all these activities. And they were able to plot them on a graph so that you could sort of almost see these wrist movements as a scatter plot. And they found that a lot of movements follow this line here. In fact, there are so many movements that follow the 10:30 to 4:30 type of trajectory. They gave it a name. They call this the dart thrower movement. Why would they call it that? Well, here's pretty cool, right? Let's go to 10:30. In fact, let's go a little lower. Let's go to like 10. Go 10 o'clock to 4. Do this diagonal here. Now, this doesn't seem like a very familiar movement when you hold your arm this way, but if you hold your arm like this and go 10 to 4, man, that's dart throwing movement, right? It's exactly what it is, especially this movement here. It looks like your wrist is bent, and it is. It's extended. But the key here is it's also off to this side here. It's also radially deviated. So 10 o'clock is when you go up and to the left. And so again, you're doing this very shallow diagonal. You're almost 9 to 3, but not quite. You're actually just a little bit up and then a little bit down at the other end. And this is, they decided that the wrist moves so naturally along this trajectory that there are a lot of human activities that tend to have a scatter plot that looks kind of like this, like the 10 to 4, or 10 to 4. So they call this dart thrower. And then the other one that we were looking at that goes like 2 o'clock to 9 o'clock, or 2 o'clock to 8 o'clock, they actually call that reverse dart thrower. How crazy is that? So one way you can think about these movements then is you have pure deviation going side to side. You have pure flexion and extension going straight up and down. You've got dart thrower going this way, which is like 10 o'clock to 4 o'clock, or maybe 10:30 to 4:30. And then you got reverse dart thrower going from 8 o'clock to like 2 o'clock, or maybe 7:30, or no, 8 o'clock to, am I getting these times wrong? Yeah, 1:30. I am getting them wrong, aren't I? I meant 1:30. 1:30 is the diagonal. So basically what we're doing here is we've got now kind of two very simple possibilities. We've got a plus sign that you can make, and then you've got an x, right? And the x, if we just start at time 0 here, I can go this way to get one of the x's, I can go this way to get another of the x's, and now I can go straight side to side to get a plus, straight up and down to get another one. The cool thing is, when it comes to guitar playing movements, there are very few times when you will do purely plus sign movements. Almost all the movements that you're going to make as a guitar player are going to be similar to one of the X shapes. Similar. In fact, depends on the way that you hold the instrument, but because the guitar is here against your body, and most of the time your arm is sort of turned a little bit in one way or another as it rests on the guitar, if we actually try to look at the wrist movements that we're making, especially during cross-picking, we're going to find that they sort of line up with one of these X's, or they're going to be similar to one of these diagonal kind of movements. So what I would like to do is take a look at some real-life examples of picking movements and see if we can figure out where on the clock face these movements actually line up. Look at this wonderful website. Who created this? They must really understand the needs of complete nerds who are also guitar players. So let's take a look at Andy Wood first. Okay. Sometimes we pull out these musical clips from our interviews that aren't really exercises or even songs or anything that you would specifically practice. And you wonder, why do we pull these things out? Well, I pulled them out as references, as technical references. So I call this one single string speed, and I want to take a look at the movement that Andy's using here. This is the original speed version of it. Here it goes. Okay. Not much to look at original speed. It's just fast hand movement, right? And if you look at the wide part of this, look at the left-hand side of the screen here. You can see that it's wrist movement. There's not really a serious arm component to this. There may be a little bit of elbow as he speeds up, but it's basically wrist movement, right? And I think back in the day we would have looked at this and said, yeah, this person's using wrist movement, whatever that means, right? And even a few years ago I probably would have looked at this and said, yeah, I don't know, wrist, or wrist deviation, I might have said, right? Because it looks more like a side-to-side movement, kind of. But now let's take a look at it in slow motion and see if we can break down what exactly he's doing here. Right, here's the slow. Okay, what are we seeing here? Well, this is a little tricky. Remember Dr. Strange? When we talk about the clock face, we're always presenting our analogy in a neutral position, so that I know that the arm is straight ahead, 0 is here, and all the numbers are around it in a circle. But that's not how we play guitar, and it's definitely not how we play mandolin. The arm is turned in some fashion. So in order to figure out where the clock points are, we have to figure out how the arm is turned. And if we head back to Andy for a second, take a look at the forearm there. I'm going to move. Kind of rewind this a little bit. You can see that the arm is, here, I'll do this on the guitar and you can take a look at it here. If we think about the strings, we'll go to the side here, you can see right here a little bit of the underside of my forearm here, right? It's a little bit exposed. The only way that you can see that is if the arm is turned. It's turned a little bit this way. This is the orientation that we call, or it's the movement we call supination. When you turn your arm this way to expose the underside, you are supinating your forearm. When you turn it the opposite way, to go this way, you are pronating the forearm. You're exposing more of the top side of your arm. So if I have a fixed orientation where I can see the underside of the forearm, at least with respect to the guitar, right, which is mainly what we care about here, I would describe this arm position as being supinated. So Andy's arm position then is a supinated arm position because I can look here and I can see the underside of the forearm. What does this mean, though, technically? It means that those two bones that we talked about, remember the radius and the ulna, are turned this way. So your thumb starts to go up in the air a little bit. Now, if you put your hand on the top of your forearm like this, you'll feel it sliding off to the side like this, just like a ramp, right? You've created a little bit of a ramp with these two bones. They're mostly flat. You could actually probably balance something on the top of your forearm because you've got the two bones. They're almost like rails, like train tracks or something. You could just put something right up there, like a guitar pick, like that, and it stays, sort of. As you supinate, though, the rails start to tilt, and that object would roll off to the side. That's how Andy's got his arm positioned here, right? So we've got this tilt to the side, and so if you position your arm like this and you touch the top of your arm, you'll feel that it tilts off a little bit. And it's interesting that I can touch the strings like this with my hand. I can almost lay even perfectly flat on the strings, but if you feel this, indeed, there is a slant or a tilt to the forearm, right? So this is a supinated arm position. Let's take a look at Andy again. Now that we know that he's supinated, let's see if we can figure out what the clock points would be from this supinated position. Okay, let's hit this back at the beginning again. Okay. Now, remember, if my arm is tilted, let's do this in clock face orientation. Let's supinate a little bit. So now I've Dr. Stranged my clock a little bit this way, right? Let's do deviation, pure deviation in the supinated orientation. That's going to be 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock. So that's this, right? This is the movement that I would be making. Let's try that on the guitar right here. Let's supinate a little bit and now do pure deviation. And what's going to happen, the downstrokes, look at this, they hit the guitar, right? I can't go past this point, because the 3 o'clock is now actually, like the guitar body is 3 o'clock. If I were to untilt and just make that arm parallel, now I could do 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock. And I can go the full range of motion. But if I supinate, now all of a sudden the 3 o'clock is here and I'm hitting the guitar, right? So let's take a look at Andy again. Is he hitting the instrument body on the downstroke? And this is where things get really interesting. No way. In fact, not only is he not hitting the instrument body on the downstroke, he's actually going away from the instrument body on the downstroke. How crazy is that? So what we're saying here is the arm is turned. He's definitely not doing this movement because this one would bottom out into the strings. He's doing something like this. Right? How neat is that? So if I do that movement, very interesting. So I have a supinated arm position. You can see that pretty clearly. But the downstroke moves away. What am I doing if I do that? Let's go to the clock face. Take it to the clock. What is it going to be? Downstroke moves away. What is it? Well, hell, it's reverse dart thrower, isn't it? It's basically like 0 to 2, approximately. If I make a bigger motion, then it's maybe, 8 o'clock to 2 o'clock, something like that. Maybe it's clustered on either side of 0 a little bit, depends on how big the movement is, but I would guess, and it's just ballpark and looking at Andy's hand, it seems like the pick stroke starts maybe a little bit on the far side of 0, it's a little bit on the 8 o'clock side of 0, not all the way down to 8, but maybe about here, and then goes up to 2 o'clock and then comes back. So this is the movement, and it's creating a line, a diagonal line that we in cracking the code lingo call pickslanting. This type of movement that goes in a straight line back and forth is a pickslanting movement. Why? Let's take a look at Andy again. We call it a pickslant because if you compare that diagonal line to the strings, see the downstroke is away from the strings. It's sort of hovering in the air. Now when he plays the upstroke, it goes back into the strings again. There it is. So now his pick is kind of in between the strings. And when he plays a downstroke, now it's in the air again. So that is your clock face movement. It's kind of 0 to 2. That's pickslanting, folks. And specifically, the pickslanting wrist movement that Andy is using here is it, well, here's a question, right? How would you describe this movement? Is it deviation? Yes. Is it flexion and extension? Yes. What is it? It's both. Why is it both? Well, for the reasons we already talked about. Here's our pie slice up here, which goes from 12 o'clock to 0 to 3 o'clock. He's moving up into the middle of the pie slice somewhere. So he's going up to like about here and then coming back to 0 again. That's a blend. If you just did pure deviation, you would go to 3 o'clock. If you just did pure extension, you'd go to 12 o'clock. To get to 2 o'clock, you have to do a little bit of both. So Andy's wrist-based picking motion here includes a bit of both. It's a little bit of extension and a little bit of deviation, and then on the way back, it's a little bit of flexion and a little bit of radial deviation, which goes in the opposite way, which is this. Here's the movement, right? And the reason this diagonal is the way it is because of the turn in Andy's arm. Remember, he's Doctor Stranging it a little bit this way, and I know he would appreciate that analogy. And so he's doing a 0 to 2 o'clock kind of picking movement. You would look at this and you'd say, I don't know, he's picking back and forth. But when you really look at it and you actually try to put it on the clock, you realize it's not back and forth at all. It's actually some weird diagonal thing. Turns out that these diagonal movements are super, super common. Many picking movements will tend to fall along one of these diagonal pathways. Hey, if you enjoyed the lesson you just watched, I highly recommend taking a stroll on over to troygrady.com for a whole lot more. This talk was actually an excerpt of a longer form lesson that we did on bluegrass cross-picking technique called cross-picking with the wrist. And in that lesson, we look at more slow motion footage of Andy Wood, David Greer, and Molly Tuttle to figure out how these incredible players perform these feats of wrist gymnastics and actually manage to pick alternate picked arpeggios with essentially perfect efficiency. Not only will you get better at guitar playing by watching this, but you will also support the work we do in solving these guitar playing investigative mysteries for all of us. Thanks so much for watching, and again, troygrady.com. Check it out.